War Between Worlds, Chapter 18, in action. Bullfrag's plan was solid. She snuck them in, disguised as prisoners, though their cuffs were regular Earth models, easily broken open by all of them once Bullfrag used a device Bluekitch had whipped up to loop the security footage. They got in completely unnoticed. They headed straight for the detention levels, and thanks to Bluekitch, they managed to get the cells open. Bluekitch took Rook to go find Dr. Psychobos and stop him controlling the Waybads. Bullfrag, Gwen, and Kevin headed down to the cell that held Grandpa Max. Bullfrag got there first, as the door opened and Max stood wobbling slightly. Bullfrag caught him. "We got you, Grandpa." He blinked and smiled, pulling the Incursion woman into a hug. "Jen?" "Jen?" Kevin spluttered. Gwen raced forward and hugged Bullfrag and Max. "Jen," Gwen reaffirmed, laughing lightly. But a crash from the doorway had them all turning to it, on guard. Atea was standing in the doorway, a blaster leveled at Bullfrag. "Jen, my father will execute you publicly for coming back." Atea smirked, but Jen didn't even flinch. Instead, she, still Bullfrag, sauntered up to Atea, a grin on her face. "Atea, good to see you." "Shut up, Tennyson!" But the Incursion princess had yet to fire, and her fingers weren't anywhere near the actual trigger on the gun. "Oh, come on, Atea. You know it was fun, these past few months, not following Daddy's rules." Atea blinked and her cheeks went dark green. She was blushing. But before she could get any further, a blast of pink light took her down. Bullfrag turned to Gwen as Atea's blaster clattered to the floor, the princess falling unconscious. "You couldn't have done that a little sooner?" "Sometimes it's fun to watch you try and talk your way out of things," Gwen said, shrugging. Kevin shook his head. "So wait, Jen, you've been Bullfrag the whole time?" She nodded, a slight smile on her face at the disbelief on her friend's face. "It wasn't safe for anyone to know it was me. The Incursions would have found out, but now that they know anyway..." She lifted a piece of armor, revealing the ever-present Omnitrix symbol, casting aside the extra piece that had been covering it. "Disengage lifeform lock. Code 1010 Jennifer Tennyson." Green lights flashed, and Jen appeared, grinning wide. Gwen pulled her into a hug. "It's so good to see your face, doofus." Jen laughed, hugging her cousin back. "It's good to have my face, dweeb." Max stepped over to them. "But you coming back will cause some problems." Jen rolled her eyes. "Yeah, I know. You guys get to clean the base. I got the Waybads." She pulled her communicator out from under her shirt. "We're up, guys." Everyone frowned, but before they could ask who "we" was, Jen had transformed into Accelerate and raced out of the base. Kevin's badge beeped. "We have located Dr. Psychobos. He appears to have called one of the Toka stars." Max stepped up to Kevin so he could be heard over the communicator too. "Jen says she has a plan, and we need to retake the base," Max stated, Gwen nodding along with her grandfather. "Jen, she is here." "Was," Kevin corrected, looking slightly smug that Rook hadn't known Jen was Bullfrag. "She was Bullfrag, was she not?" Rook asked, and Kevin pouted. "Not the time for that now. We need to take out Psychobos and take back the base." Gwen cut across them, and the three of them raced back to the main console in the detention rooms, releasing the other plumbers. Jen made it outside just as one of the female Waybads stepped into the city limits. She swore under her breath and turned back into herself, pulling her communicator. "Tell me you guys have it ready," she demanded over the comms. "We're ready when you are." Ta's voice came over the comm, and Jen grinned. "Excellent. Beam it down, Scotty." Ta laughed. "You know the only reason I know that reference is because we shared a brain." Jen shrugged. "Let me have my fun." A crackle of energy materialized in front of Jen, and a large bag landed in front of her. She grinned, pulling it open and checking the contents. The Waybad was getting closer, and a man in a firefighter uniform was rushing bystanders inside. He blinked when he caught sight of Jen. "Gen 10? The frogs said they finished you off!" Jen shook her head, setting the bag back down. "Not yet." She spun the dial on the Omnitrix. We're ready to help, human and alien. Jen looked up a little confused. There were both aliens and humans here peeking out of doors and windows. She nodded. Best you can do right now is get everyone off the streets and out of harm's way. The firefighter nodded, and Jen slapped down the dial on the Omnitrix, switching to Jet Ray and picking up the bag in her talons. It was easy to rile the Waybad up and get her out of town. Getting in close enough to tag her with one of the devices in the bag was harder, but Jen managed it and raced off in a blur around the globe. In moments, a loud boom echoed as Jet Ray shattered the sound barrier. It couldn't have taken her more than 15 minutes to tag every Waybad on the planet. She skidded to a landing, back on the outskirts of Bellwood, and grinned, dropping the bag and pulling out her communicator. Tagged! Bag them! A quick affirmative from the other end sounded as a Waybad approached her, roaring. Rook shook his head at the screen in front of him. He'd disabled Dr. Psychobos, but now the Waybads, who'd mostly just been patrolling, only occasionally doing the bidding of the doctor, were rampaging. Or at least they started to, until they each screamed and a film of red light covered them individually. A moment passed, then they blinked out of existence. Rook frowned, but Dreba seemed to understand what had happened. That was the same energy as the null void projector, he exclaimed, grinning wide. Got it in one, Dreba! Jen's voice echoed through the base. Rook let out a belt of laughter as a weight lifted off his chest. It was one thing to be told that Jen was alive and whole, but hearing her voice again lightened his heart exponentially. Good to hear you too, partner. Jen laughed, correctly interpreting his merriment. Now, anyone got eyes on Milius's ship? Rook refocused on the screens and quickly located the ship. It had lifted off, though it was still riding quite close to the ground. It was also charging his main gun. Jen, they have a lock on you. Move! Rook called out, and Jen's transmission cut off. Rook's heart dropped as Milius fired at the spot where his partner had been moments before. But as the dust cleared, Waybig stood tall, lashing out at the ship, which had just barely missed. A pod shot out of the ship as Waybad took hold of it and ripped it in two, tossing the pieces in separate directions. Rook turned away from the screen as Gwen raced up to him. We need to get out there. Max and Kevin were with her, both armed, Atea and Psychobos both in cuffs behind them. Rook nodded, and Gwen held out both hands, chanting as pink light enveloped them. They vanished from the base and reappeared in a crater. A long skid the tossed ship had created. A pod lay in front of them, not dissimilar to the one the Incursions had used to shoot Jen off planet. The girl herself was standing next to the small crater the pod had caused with its landing. Emperor Milius! Good to see you, she grinned. Looks like you've misplaced your mutant Tokastars. The overly large frog scrambled to his feet. I still have my regular army, an armada of super destroyers, and a conquest ray. And we have you, Max stated, and Gwen conjured a bubble of mana around the frog. Which puts me in charge. Atea grinned as she managed to pick the locks on her cuffs. Jen turned to the princess, a slight smile on her face. Which was your plan all along? Everyone blinked at the two. Was I that obvious? The Incursion asked with a grin. Jen shrugged. You could have killed me on Incarsicon, been done with it, but you didn't. I didn't have you fully figured out until a couple of weeks ago. Daddy's rule was getting a bit stifling, wasn't it? Atea grinned. Aren't you the clever one? I did sabotage your pod, left one of your restraints a little loose. I knew you'd never sit by while your world was in any kind of danger, Atea said, grinning as she stepped up to Jen. Rook's hand inched toward the blaster he'd taken from Psychobos' lab. Jen shook her head lightly. You are all kinds of twisted, Jen said, a smile still pulling at her lips. Oh, I know, but ever since you beat me last time, Daddy's been keeping me under too close a watch. I knew you were the ticket to freeing up the throne. So here's my deal. I walk away and take the Armada with me. You keep Daddy, and the Empire goes back to last year's borders. Earth becomes off limits. Kevin frowned. You'd be getting off clean. He sounded almost impressed.
Life's never fair, but it's the truth I'm offering. You don't want war.
Jen shook her head, looking downright impressed at the incursion. Earth accepts your offer, Max stated, cutting off the others. He stepped up to Atea and they shook hands as the ship landed behind the princess. Well, Empress now, Jen supposed.
Pleasure,
Atea said, raising a hand to hold back the incursions about to spill out of the ship.
We'll pay for damages. A small price to pay for power, really.
I should have kept you in that stasis pod, backstabbing traitor.
Milius griped, but a smile made its way onto his face.
I don't think I've ever been more proud.
Atea made her way onto the gangplank of the ship, but turned before she entered it fully.
You want to come with, Jennison? You made a fantastic incursion. Lose the monkey look and turn back into bullfrog. See the stars with me.
The tension in the air was nearly palpable. Jen shook her head. You know, I think I'm good. Jen turned away as Atea shrugged.
You're lost.
Her tongue flicked out across the distance between them, slapping almost gently across the back of Jen's head. Jen turned slightly indignant, and Atea just winked at her before boarding the ship and taking off. Kevin's badge beeped, and he answered. It was Magister Patellidae. Incursions are pulling back. Jen grinned and stepped up to walk next to Rook. I have one more thing to do. Then I need a smoothie. Rook laughed, glad to know that some things would never change. Chapter 19. Cleaning Up. They reached the base quickly, and Jen pulled Rook aside as soon as they got into the base. Come on. She dragged him off before anyone could say anything. Most of the equipment had survived the incursion occupation. Now that the fear and adrenaline was dying down, Rook finally really looked at his partner. She had been missing, presumed dead, for nearly 2 full months. She had apparently spent at least part of that time undercover as an incursion. Looking at her now, really looking, he could see that these past few weeks had been just as rough on her as they had on them. There were dark circles under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights without end. Her hair was normally short, shaved on the sides and slightly fluffy on top, but she hadn't cut her hair since well before the invasion, and that seemed to make all the difference. Her hair now reached her jawline. It apparently kept growing as time passed in her other transformations. He frowned as she dragged him into the hangar bay. There were several ships here. Jen frowned. Shit, I forgot the proto-truck got trashed, she commented, looking around, then grinned at a green hot rod number that Rook had never actually seen leave the hangar. She nodded, dragging him towards it. Rust Bucket 3 it is. She had both of them on the ship before Rook could ask any questions. She studied the controls for a moment before grinning. Cooper, you lovely little technopath, you installed the cloaking drive. Jen, Rook began, but as she flicked switches and opened the hangar, the comms on the ship came to life. Who? Oh, Jen, what are you doing on the Rust Bucket? It was Kevin. Got an errand to run. Be back soon. She cut off the transmission and ducked under the console, coming back out with a cord he knew to connect to the communicators and tracking system in the ship. She pulled her Tadenite dagger and sliced through the line. Rook frowned. Without that line, we have no communications. Jen nodded. Yeah, I know, but it also means they can't track us. Rook nodded as Jen took her seat and pulled the ship out of the hangar, engaging the cloak as soon as they were out of the hangar. Rook frowned. Jen, I do not understand. Where have you been? What happened to the Waybads? Jen raised a hand to forestall his questions. I know you have questions, and I promise I will answer them as soon as we're done. Done with what? But she was already pulling the cloaked ship into a landing. Rook frowned, following her out. She stopped and swore under her breath. Spinning the dial on the Omnitrix, she grabbed Rook's hand as she transformed into Stardust, her Anodite form. She flipped his hand so it was palm up. This is going to sting for a second. She grew a small, sharp point of mana from one of her greenish-black fingers and pricked his palm with it. She allowed 2 drops of blood to leave his hand before sealing the pinprick. She released his hand. He was only marginally disappointed, more interested in what she was doing, as she separated the blood drops into 2. One floated up into the air in front of them, glowing green, and with her free hand, Jen drew a rune in the air. The drop of blood sank into the rune, and Rook blinked as a shimmery outline of a barrier appeared in front of them. It wasn't invisible, it was an ion shield. If they had gotten any closer, it would have fried him. He figured her DNA was already keyed into the shield. He seemed to be right as Stardust floated over to a buried access panel and pulled it up to the surface, typing in an access code. The panel opened and the second drop of blood was dropped in. The machine whirred and beeped happily before Stardust reburied it and flashed back to normal. She turned to Rook. No one knows about this place. Well, practically no one, and you can't tell anyone about it either. I promise. But where? She pulled him through the barrier. Now that his DNA was in the system, the ion shield passed over him with barely a tingle. Beyond the barrier, there lay a house, 2 stories tall, forest green with a wraparound porch, and a large stretch of fencing. Before he could ask why they were there, Jen had dropped his hand and took off running. She took the porch stairs 2 at a time and nearly leaping them all together and running to the door. Someone beat her to it and yanked it open, revealing her parents, who scooped her practically off her feet. Rook smiled. She got them back to the base after that, her parents, Gwen's parents, and Cooper, who had been there as an extra layer of defense for the family. Rook also sort of thought it was to keep him out of Incursion hands. He could manipulate any kind of technology. He'd be a very useful hostage. They arrived back at the base just in time to spot a ship about the size of a football field entering the atmosphere. Jen grinned, then swore as several shots fired from the base at the ship. Forgot to tell them about that. Everyone hold on. She switched on the shielding and swerved between the ship and the base, blocking the fire, which stopped quickly. Jen released the controls one-handed and pulled her communicator out from under her shirt and off, tossing it to Rook. Call Grandpa and tell him to please stop shooting my friends. Rook did as he was told, and all fire ceased. Jen pulled the rust bucket into the hangar, and the large ship was directed to the empty hangar next door. Jen hopped out of the rust bucket before the gangplank was even all the way down. Rook, hot on her heels. Gwen was waiting for them. Jen, what the heck? Mom! Dad! Gwen was up the ramp in an instant. If Rook hadn't been watching her, he'd have said that she teleported to them. They wrapped her in a hug as Jen took off for the other hangar. Rook followed close behind and just managed to catch the fireworks as the ship opened, revealing 2 large beings. One was a grayish-green figure, a female who might have been Vaxasaurian except for the fact that they just didn't exist in that color and never had metal on them or green eyes. If he hadn't known better, he might have thought it was Jen, but the second figure elicited a response. He was large, as well, almost as large as the first figure, a Detrovite, full-sized, unlike Volcanus, as much of his body was exposed. He had a mace-like hand and wore no shirt, and his eyes fixed on Kevin and hardened. Technorg, no! But the Detrovite had already lunged at the Osmosian, whose eyes went wide. At the name, he dove to the side as Technorg registered Jen's order and skidded to a halt. Plumbers had guns drawn, and Kevin had absorbed the metal of the hangar floor. But Jen stepped in front of the Detrovite. Can everyone please put their weapons down? Kevin spluttered, and Jen shot him a look, shutting him up. The plumbers lowered their guns, clearly not wanting to aim them at her. She nodded and turned to Technorg.
I am sorry, smallest warrior. I was not entirely sure he could be trusted.
Jen rolled her eyes. Kevin saved my life a few more times than you have by now. He's changed. The Detrovite nodded and dropped to one knee. That made a lot of the plumbers blink. Detrovites weren't known for their honor.
My life still belongs to you, smallest warrior.
Jen shook her head, pulling him to his feet with some difficulty. No, not anymore. You repaid whatever debt there was left by helping me save Earth. Now we should probably let everyone else in on that story. Over food, please. Living off Incursion rations is not fun. That drew a laugh from the surrounding plumbers. Jen turned to Magister Patellidae, who was looking much better after a dip in the pool on base. Can we get their whole crew fed? I know it's a bit of a stress because of everything, but they did help me save the day. Patellidae nodded. Tennyson, you have the strangest friends, but yeah, we'll make it happen. Can't have 'em wandering around too much, though. We're not sure what the frogs may have done to the base. Jen nodded and spoke to Technorg again. Though this time, the two of them stepped away from the plumbers, who now set to work checking over protocols and cataloging damages. Jen stepped over to Rook as Technorg stepped over to his second-in-command to speak to her. Come on, partner. Let me tell you the whole story.